Chapter 1: The Epoch, Social, Scientific Backdrop and the Problem the Philosopher Tried to Solve. In the life of a single mind, the hour of birth may be ordinary, the early schooling routine merely routine, and yet the century, its wars, its puzzles, its fever of new ideas, will press upon that mind with a pressure that writes itself into the texture of its thoughts. Such is the case with Plato, though the man who would become Plato first appeared in a city that already wore its crises as a badge of identity. The aim of this chapter is to set the stage, to sketch the social rhythms and scientific questions of Athens and its wider Hellenic world, and to name the problem that the young philosopher would carry as a burden and a beacon. In this epoch, the political and the epistemic were not separate theatres but shared scaffolds upon which a citizen's life was built. The problem Plato would attempt to solve grew out of that shared scaffold: how to know what justice is, how to translate that knowledge into just institutions, and how to secure a vision of the good life in a city perpetually buffeted by public opinion, power, and change. The epoch's social pulse, democracy under strain and the education of citizens. To understand Plato's project we must first feel the tremor of the city-states, especially Athens, as it tested the limits and legibility of its own ideals. The late 5th century BCE in Athens, sometimes called a long shadow of the city's golden age, was a laboratory of political experiment and moral crisis. Democracy, the most celebrated experiment in broad participation in governance, offered a vivid alternative to monarchy, oligarchy, or aristocratic privilege. It invited the many to speak, to vote, to judge, and to judge again. It also invited demagoguery, faction, and rapid shifts in popular will. The assembly became the forum where justice, war, peace, law, and ritual life were contested in public view. The courts functioned as another arena of public judgment, reinforcing the conviction that political life was inseparable from public reasoning about what counted as a good life. Within that public theatre, education, the ancient Greek concept of paideia, was the private tutor of civic character. The period's education was not a narrow preparation for a trade but a broad forging of a person who might participate in public life with discernment and courage. Music, poetry, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, philosophy, these were the arts through which a citizen learned to order stimuli, to discern patterns, and to argue with both clarity and persuasive force. Yet education was also contested terrain. The sophists, traveling teachers who offered to teach virtue for a fee, claimed to equip citizens with the tools to win arguments, to persuade peers, and to secure advantage in the rough-and-tumble marketplaces of law and policy. They did not necessarily claim universal truths; rather, they offered techniques, often pragmatic, sometimes persuasive beyond measure. For a generation, the sophists posed a challenge to traditional ideals of virtue. If rhetoric could move crowds, what, then, counted as genuine knowledge? And if knowledge was contingent upon audience and occasion, how could a city found its policies on anything more robust than the shifting gusts of opinion? Against this backdrop, the social fabric was being tested by two interwoven currents. First, the democratic experiment, despite its alluring promise of political equality, wrestled with the problem of expertise. How do a people governed by debate and majority decision orient themselves toward what is just and lasting, when true knowledge seems scarce and competing voices claim competence? Second, the city's experiences of war and plague, epidemic in the extreme during the last decades of the 5th century, shattered certainties about security and meaning. The plague of Athens around 430 BCE is not merely a historical fact, it is a symbol of a civilization adrift, where the certainty of patriotic stories and reverence for ancestral forms seemed to falter in the face of senseless suffering. Such shocks prompted a search for anchors that could outlast the storms of fortune, principles that did not bend with the crowd, standards that did not alter with changing governors, a rational order capable of withstanding the pliability of rhetoric. The social order was also marked by family life, religious practice, and civic ritual, all of which fed into a shared expectation that a citizen enact virtue, serve the polis, and cultivate temperance, courage, and justice. Yet the city was not a uniform organism. It was pluralistic in its influences and features, regional loyalties, economic stratifications, and the persisting memory of identical yet divergent moral frameworks. The result was a public space where the right way to live did not look identical to one generation to the next. The demand for stable standards, of truth, of right action, of beauty, grew sharper as the social fabric grew more tangled. The scientific backdrop, a mind of inquiry emerging from a sea of change. If the social landscape was a field of competing voices, the scientific landscape was a field of questions about ultimate principles. The Greek world was not a closed circle but a ferment of ideas about the nature of reality, change, and the place of humans within a universe that felt both intelligible and baffling. The pre-Socratic thinkers, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Zeno, tore into the assumption that the world's most fundamental nature could be captured by a single element or principle. They debated whether water, air, emptiness, or some unknowable arch, lay at the foundation of all things. They asked whether change was an illusion, whether being could truly be plural, whether the cosmos rested on rational order or random flux. In this tradition, knowledge was not merely a set of practical tips, it was a path to understanding the underpinnings of the world. Geometry and mathematics began to enter philosophy as a language of necessity rather than mere counting. The Pythagorean affinity for numbers as the ultimate reality pointed toward a view of order that could be expressed with precision and eternal recurrence. The Greek mind started to imagine a world where arithmetic and geometry did not simply calculate how to build a roof or measure a plot of land, but could indicate the structure of reality itself. This shift, toward rational structures that described and governed even the most diffuse phenomena, supplied a powerful counterpart to political life. If the city could be made right by rules grounded in reason, then perhaps the universe itself offered a model of how order arises from intelligible law. The scientifically inflected climate of the era was not a retreat from public life but a challenge to it. The sophists and the new understanding of rhetoric intruded upon the old sense that virtue was a fixed craft learned by tradition and disciplined practice. The philosopher would, in this sense, place himself in opposition to the belief that cunning and eloquence alone could secure a just life. The philosopher, if he pursued truth, would demand more than pleasing speech, he would demand a reliable ground for knowledge that could guide actions in both the home and the assembly, in the courts and the corridors of power. The problem foreshadowed by the era's science and its social reverberations would become the compass for the thinker who sought to transform not just a city's laws but the very way people came to know. The central problem the philosopher sought to solve. From the vantage point of the epoch, a single, stubborn question rose above all others: how can we live justly in the world as it is? But this question can be unpacked into more precise and pressing components. First is the problem of knowledge. What can we know with certainty about reality, virtue, and the good life? If appearances are deceiving or unstable, how can a city trust a shared standard for justice? The sophists taught that knowledge might be relative to the speaker, audience, and context. The philosopher's challenge was to propose a knowledge claim robust enough to stand in the face of rhetorical pressure, political expediency, and the inexorable flux of fortune. Second is the problem of political life. What form should the city take so that the life of its citizens is not merely comfortable or powerful, but good? The city in which Plato would increasingly invest his imagination was a city in tension between two poles. On one pole stood the voice of democratic participation that could liberate the individual and encourage civic virtue. On the opposite pole stood the risk of demagogic manipulation that could foment faction and tyranny. The problem was not a simple contrast between freedom and order, it was a search for a form of governance in which knowledge about virtue and the good could reside in the guardians of the city rather than be dissolved into the shifting will of the many. Third is the problem of education. If the city's life depends on its citizens' capacity for judgment, then what kind of education fosters reliable judgment? Here the question becomes even more concrete: which sources of knowledge are reliable, and which authorities deserve allegiance? The sophists argued that skill in speech and the appearance of wisdom could produce authority. the philosopher sought to displace that authority by offering a foundation that did not depend on persuasion alone but on the apprehension of universal, unchanging truths. Yet if such truths exist, can they be taught to a city that must, in some sense, live with the imperfect, political, and contingent creature that is human society? Fourth is the problem of the good and the beautiful as they relate to political life. What does it mean for a city to be just, and what does it mean for a person to be virtuous? In the traditional Athenian framework, virtue had a robust social dimension. The virtues were practices that ensured the household and the city would prosper. But the philosophical mind sought a more fixed, more universal account of virtue as such. The form of the good, the nature of justice, and the idea of a reality that transcends time and opinion began to present themselves as potential anchors for both moral action and political structure. If there is a stable standard of the true, the good, and the beautiful, the city's laws and its leaders might be oriented toward that standard rather than merely toward the pragmatic successes of the moment. The problem in its most telling form is thus not merely a question about whether a city can be just, nor a question about what counts as knowledge, but a claim about the unity of truth, virtue, and governance. Plato would come to insist that true knowledge, knowledge of the forms, offers the only reliable basis for a life that is both good and wise, both personal and political. He would argue that the republic of a city cannot be built on rhetoric and habit alone, for rhetoric and habit tend to imitate the surface of things rather than disclose their underlying structure. A city built on appearances could be swayed by quarrels, by censure, by the shifting tides of majority sentiment. A city built on knowledge of universal truths would possess a steadiness that could endure the city's storms. The seeds of Plato's program, a transition from dialogue to system. To see how this problem becomes a project, it is essential to glimpse the intellectual atmosphere that would cradle his later, more systematic meditations. The young Plato did not arise in a vacuum. He learned from and moved among a lineage of thinkers who debated the sufficiency and the limits of human reason. The Socratic method, elenchus, perpetual question, and the search for definitions, provided a method of tightening the ship of inquiry against the sea of opinion. The Socratic insistence that one should not merely accept inherited beliefs but test them against the demands of coherence and virtue, this insistence, though not yet a formal theory, prepared the intellectual ground for an eventual philosophy that would claim authority beyond persuasion. At the same time, the city's crisis of authority, where the sophists claimed practical expertise in teaching virtue for money and where democratic processes could be swayed by rhetorical skill, made a compelling case for a discipline capable of offering something more stable than the crowd's sudden verdicts. Education, in such a climate, could not be reduced to the passive transmission of tradition or the active mastering of persuasive techniques. It had to cultivate the soul, its rational faculty, its moral sensibility, and its sense of the beautiful and the true, in a way that would enable a person to see beyond the day's concerns and to discern the enduring patterns of reality. That is the seed of what would become the Platonic project, a systematic effort to render knowledge of the good, the true, and the beautiful as objects of deliberate, disciplined inquiry, and to ground political life on the results of that inquiry. This is not to say that Plato's thought was born fully formed in a single leap. The trajectory from Socratic dialogic method to the more comprehensive philosophical system is a gradual ascent. Yet the epoch itself supplied a powerful impetus, a demand for a rational order capable of resisting manipulation by rhetoric, demand for an education that could nurture discernment rather than mere cleverness, and a demand for political arrangements that could align power with knowledge. Plato would come to answer this demand not by repudiating the city but by reimagining the city as the place where the highest kinds of knowledge could be made practical and intelligible to citizens capable of assent to the common good. Plato's problem, reframed as a philosophical project. Viewed through the lens of this epoch, Plato's central problem can be reframed as a triad. How can we know the real? How can that knowledge be expressed in just institutions? And how can education cultivate guardians who could steward both knowledge and polity? The problem of knowledge includes not only the mechanics of learning but the metaphysical question of what counts as real. If ordinary sense perception and opinion lie within the realm of change and flux, what anchors can be offered that remain reliable in the face of experience's variations? The problem of politics concerns not merely building a stable regime but ensuring that its rule rests on those who have access to the best kind of knowledge, the knowledge of the forms, which would include the form of the good that makes every other good intelligible. The problem of education is the practical bridge that would allow the philosopher's abstract insights to become public policy. If the city could be so organized as to train its rulers in philosophy rather than merely to train its citizens in the arts of persuasion, it might avoid the collapse into demagoguery or the drift into factional tyranny. Education would thus become the method by which a city could approximate the rational structure of the good. The guardian class, educated to see beyond appearances, would be equipped to weigh laws, to judge just grievances, and to direct cultural life in ways that promote virtue and wisdom rather than fleeting satisfaction or popular acclaim. The philosopher, far from withdrawing from life, would assume responsibility for shaping the life of the city by means of a disciplined understanding of reality. A portrait of the problem's scope in the city's life. Consider what it would mean if a city could be governed by those who truly understood what counts as the good. Such governance would not merely enforce rules, it would cultivate an intelligible order that dignified every citizen's life because the regime itself instantiated the right kind of order. It would not be enough to arrest passions or to punish crimes, the city would need to educate its citizens toward a shared sense of the good that binds them to the city's ultimate purposes. The problem, then, is not simply how to run a good state, but how to form minds capable of discerning the good and willing to submit to it. If such minds exist, the city would harbor a political structure that could resist the temptations of faction and the lure of demagogues. If they do not exist, the city remains vulnerable to the cunning of rhetoric, the inertia of habit, and the disorder of power. In the coming pages, we will trace how Plato's early dialogues moved toward a more explicit, cohesive program. We will consider how he inherits the Socratic method, how he absorbs the criticisms and lessons of the age, the critique of relativism, the suspicion of empty rhetoric, the demand for a justification of political life, and how he begins to articulate a theory that would attempt to unify the moral life, the intellectual life, and the political life under a shared vision of reality. We will see a mind turning a critical eye toward the question of governance, asking not only who should rule but what kind of knowledge would justify rule. We will see the early signs of a project that will insist on the existence of a realm beyond appearance, an eternal order that shapes the way things truly are and, by extension, how they ought to be. The shadow of Socrates and the lure of the forms. Any account of Plato's epoch would be incomplete without acknowledging the shadow cast by Socrates. The elder philosopher's method, question, examine, expose inconsistencies, and force the interlocutor to face the contradictions in their own beliefs, was a radical departure from the conventional training of citizens. Socrates asked what virtue is, what justice demands, and what it means to know something in a way that justifies action. He challenged the confident assertion that one can possess practical wisdom by mere experience or eloquent speech. He compelled his audiences to pause and consider whether they actually know the things they presume to know. In doing so, Socrates offered a glimpse of a different standard for truth, a standard not reducible to popular opinion or the cleverness of a speaker's voice. For Plato, the Socratic method could become a ladder toward a higher possibility. The ladder would not end in a mere technique of interrogation but would lead to the discovery of universal truths about reality. If virtue could be defined and knowledge could be claimed with warrant beyond persuasion, then political life might be anchored in something more enduring than the shifting sands of public sentiment. The problem was not just to preserve the city from demagoguery but to transform the citizens' understanding of reality so that public life could be guided by reasoned insight rather than rhetoric alone. The forms, those timeless, perfect exemplars that stand behind the appearances of the sensible world, would become the objects toward which philosophy and politics would strive. The good would not be a matter of preference but a standard that could ground both ethical action and communal policy. Conclusion: the epoch as a crucible and a compass. The epoch in which Plato began his career was not a mere historical backdrop. It served as a crucible that heated a particular set of questions until they shone with a certain intensity. What is knowledge? What is virtue? And what sort of social order would best realize a life worth living? The social fabric of Athens, its democracy, its education, its crises, offered both the test and the incentive to think beyond customary answers. The scientific questions, the pre-Socratic search for a principle that underwrites change, the rise of mathematical thinking as a language of necessity, offered tools and models for thinking about reality as something comprehensible and, in principle, knowable. The problem the philosopher would take up, how to unite knowledge with governance, how to educate for a life governed by the truth, how to secure a city that could endure the winds of fortune, emerges as a definitional aim, not merely as a personal interest, but as a social need. In this sense, the portrait of the epoch is a portrait of a mind in formation. The young Plato did not encounter a world already answered. He confronted a world that had begun to doubt whether the most familiar forms of authority, custom, tradition, rhetoric, could carry a city to a stable and good life. He would respond, not by denying the social reality of the polis or by withdrawing into solitary speculation, but by refining a question: if the city is to be governed, what kind of knowledge should govern it? The answer would not be an easy one, nor would it be pithy. It would be a long project, one that would demand the careful cultivation of intellect and the exacting discipline of moral imagination. And it would begin in this epoch, a social experiment in democracy, a storm of ideas about knowledge and change, and a stubborn, hopeful belief that truth, if pursued with due rigor, might guide a city toward wisdom. As we turn to the subsequent chapters, we will enter more directly into Plato's early dialogues, where the seeds of a systematic philosophy begin to sprout, and we will trace the ways in which his response to the epoch's problems would mature into a comprehensive philosophical program. What began in the crucible of Athens, with its public forums and its private doubts, would, for Plato, become a blueprint, a portrait of a philosopher's attempt to reconcile the fellowship of a city with the order of the universe. The epoch and the problem are inseparable. They are the weather that formed the philosopher's early temper and the horizon toward which his thought set its gaze.